In Chapter 12, we'll be introduced to the central nervous system. So the human nervous system has two anatomical subdivisions, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So anatomically, we studied them separately, but they are seamlessly connected, and each division is highly dependent upon one another. So that is, the central nervous system would not function properly without the peripheral nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system would not function properly without the central nervous system. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, while the peripheral nervous system consists of nerves and ganglia. So nerves are cord-like bundles of neuron axons that arise from either the brain or the spinal cord. Both the brain and the spinal cord have nerves that emerge from it, although in this diagram they don't show the nerves that are emerging from the brain, which are called the cranial nerves, but we will see them in other diagrams in later chapters. So ganglia, or singular ganglion, are not like bulges in nerves that contain the neuron cell bodies of the neurons within those particular nerves, or I should say some of the neurons within those particular nerves. So since our focus of this chapter is the central nervous system, let's begin with the anatomy and the functions of the brain, and then later on in this chapter, we'll take a look at the spinal cord. So the human brain is probably one of the more familiar anatomical structures. So even if you've never taken a human anatomy class before, then one of the structures that's probably the most easily recognizable, other than the human skeleton, is the human brain. So in the average adult, the brain weighs about 3.3 pounds, and it's roughly the size of two fists that are put together. The first thing that we notice about the brain is the foldedness of the brain, or the kind of wrinkled appearance of the brain. So the outer surface of this part of the brain that we call the cerebrum, and this smaller part right here, which is called the cerebellum, are elaborately folded, and they take on this wrinkled appearance, kind of similar to the appearance of a walnut. So this wrinkling or folding occurs because during development, the brain is growing more rapidly than the fibrous membrane-like tissue that will eventually become the skull. So therefore, the brain actually has to fold in order to occupy that available space. The folding of the brain is also really important because it gives the brain a larger surface area, and this means that there are a greater number of neurons that can occupy the brain and the space within the brain than if the brain were smooth. So if the brain were smooth, it wouldn't have as much surface area, and not as many neurons would be able to occupy that available space. So indeed, if the brain does not fold during development, such as what happens with an extremely rare condition called agyria, we know that agyria is a cause of major mental retardation and things like that. And so this occurs when the brain is unable to fold during development. And this is, smooth brains, again, are not as able to have as many connections, and they have far fewer neurons in them than brains that develop normally. So in this case, we want our brains to have that wrinkled appearance. So let's talk about the major brain regions now. There are four major brain regions. We'll start with the largest and the most obvious of the brain regions, called the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest and the most conspicuous region of the human brain. It occupies or forms really kind of the superior part of the brain. As I mentioned, it is the largest part. It makes up an impressive 83% of brain mass. And we'll see later that the cerebrum is divided anatomically into hemispheres. That is, there's a right and a left hemisphere, and then each hemisphere is further subdivided into regions that are called lobes. And the cerebral lobes each perform a variety of functions, but overall we attribute the functions of the cerebrum as the cerebrum gives us things like awareness of ourselves, awareness of our sensations, our perceptions. It gives us our ability to speak and communicate, to remember, understand, form memories. and also control skeletal muscle movement. And so because of this suite of functions, or this host of functions, we typically refer to the cerebrum as the executive suite. That is, these are higher level thinking and higher level types of processing that are occurring within the tissue and the different regions of the cerebrum. So this is the cerebrum. Anatomically, if we look at the cerebrum, we can give names to the folds and the ridges in the cerebrum. The elevated ridges of cerebral tissue are referred to as gyri, or singular gyrus, while the shallow grooves that are between those ridges are referred to as sulci, or singular sulcus, if we're just referring to one of them. There are also a handful of deep grooves within the cerebrum, which are collectively referred to as the fissures. So shallow grooves are called sulci, deep grooves are called fissures. So typically fissures have very specific names. And so for instance, the longitudinal fissure is the boundary between the left and the right cerebral hemispheres. So I did mention cerebral hemispheres before, and speaking of cerebral hemispheres, we see that because the cerebrum is divided at the mid-sagittal plane, as I mentioned, this gives the cerebrum a right half and a left half, and we call these the right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere, respectively here. And it turns out that the cerebral hemispheres have what is called contralateral control over the body. So that is, the right cerebral hemisphere senses or receives sensory information and controls things like skeletal muscles on the left side of the body. So that is, again, the right cerebral hemisphere senses and controls the left side of the body, while the left cerebral hemisphere receives sensory information and controls things like skeletal muscles on the right side of the body. So contralateral implies opposite control, or sensations are coming in from the opposite side of the body from that particular cerebral hemisphere. So moving on from the cerebrum, we have to look internally to see the remaining regions of the brain. And the second of the regions that we're going to take a look at is a region in the very center of the cerebrum that's called the diencephalon. And this kind of forms the inner core of the brain. And it is almost entirely surrounded by the two cerebral hemispheres around it. So the diencephalon consists of three paired structures. We have the thalamus, which is located superiorly. It's kind of this egg or oval shaped structure that you see here. We have the hypothalamus, which is this triangular shaped region that's located anteriorly and inferiorly of the thalamus. And just behind or just posterior to the thalamus, we have what's called the epithalamus, which are these kind of light purple structures that you see here. And these are located posteriorly and inferiorly to the thalamus. So when I say that the diencephalon consists of paired structures, what I mean by this is that these structures also have a left and a right half. So there's a left and a right half to the thalamus, left and right half to the hypothalamus. So we see the same kind of general organization that we see in terms of right and left halves in the diencephalon structures that we see in the cerebral structures as well. So at the inferior aspect of the brain, or the inferior part of the brain, we have the brain stem, and this is the brain structure that joins the brain to the spinal cord. So similar to the diencephalon, the brainstem also contains three major structures or regions. The superior part of the brainstem is referred to as the midbrain. The anterior and inferior part of the brainstem is a mound-shaped region that is referred to as the pons. And the inferior-most aspect of the brainstem is referred to as the medulla oblongata, or simply the medulla. And the medulla is the structure that actually joins the brain to the spinal cord, because all of this down here that is inferior to the medulla oblongata is the spinal cord. And finally, we have the final region of the brain that we're going to take a look at. It is the posterior, and it makes up the posterior and inferior aspect of the brain. And this is a structure that is called the cerebellum. So it essentially resembles a small version of the cerebrum. And Indeed, its name, cerebellum, actually means little brain because it superficially resembles the cerebrum. Now, functionally, the cerebellum receives input from the parts of the cerebrum that control skeletal muscle movement. The cerebellum also receives input from the brainstem, and it also receives sensory input from sensory receptors in the joints and muscles. And so using all of this sensory input and information that it's gathering from various parts of the body and the brain, the cerebellum coordinates skeletal muscle movement so that movements are smooth and coordinated and controlled. So now that we've seen the major brain regions, I want to kind of take a step back and look at the superficial and deep arrangement of these tissue, particularly of the cerebrum and the cerebellum. The brain actually has a superficial and deep organization to it, and as I mentioned, particularly the cerebrum and the cerebellum show this organization. So if we look at a section of the brain through an MRI or through a CT scan, we see that there is a layer of dark material on the superficial surface of the brain, and the inner layers, or the deeper layers, consists of a lighter material. And we see that kind of echoed in this diagram to the left here. So these materials are referred to as the gray matter, which is superficially located, and the white matter, which is more deeply located within the brain, or within the cerebrum or the cerebellum, respectively. So the gray matter of the cerebrum and the cerebellum is referred to as the cerebral cortex and the cerebellar cortex. So because we're looking at the cerebrum here, this would be the cerebral cortex. If we were looking at the superficial part of the cerebellum, we would call that gray matter that makes up the superficial part of the cerebellum. We call it the cerebellar cortex. So the gray matter consists of neuron somas and dendrites. So this is primarily where the cell bodies and the dendrites of neurons are housed. Because these materials are not covered in myelin, they are gray in color in fresh tissue. And the deep white matter is where the axons of these neurons are located. So you can kind of think of the white matter as a jumble of cords or cables that are connecting different structures within the brain, or connecting those neurons to different parts of the body below the brain or the spinal cord. So the axons that are located in this white matter are typically very heavily myelinated. And remember that myelin is a material that gives tissue a very whitish appearance because myelin has a high lipid content. And so anytime you have a high amount of lipids present in a particular tissue, it tends to take on kind of a whitish appearance. And so remember that dendrites and neuron somas are not myelinated because they don't create action potentials, and so there's no need for myelin on those structures. And so this is why the superficial surface of the cerebrum and the cerebellum appear gray in color, because they have no myelin on them. The cavities that you see here in these diagrams and in this MRI or CT image here are actually small spaces, small fluid-filled spaces within the brain that are referred to as ventricles. And we'll talk about those towards the end of the chapter when we kind of start to wrap up our overview of the brain structures.